Parthenogenesis, or virgin birth, is a relatively rare process that has been documented in reptiles, birds, sharks, and other species, which permits a female of the species to produce an offspring without a male contribution. In short, it occurs when an egg cell begins dividing on its own without the introduction of a sperm cell. With rare exceptions, if a viable offspring is produced, it is always a genetic clone of its mother. There are several mechanisms observed which permit this among those species. To date, while technically feasible, it has not been formally documented in mammals in nature. In 2004, scientists at the Tokyo University of Agriculture successfully induced parthenogenesis in a mouse, producing an offspring without the introduction of sperm or the male chromosome. In August of 2007, it was revealed that a Korean scientist had successfully created human embryos through parthenogenesis under laboratory conditions as a part of his research into stem cells and stem cell production. Human parthenogenesis, according to one research article by graduate students in Brazil, is not necessarily a rare occurrence, but almost always results in benign tumors called teratomas. These teratomas may, on the rare occasion, develop in such a way to where the basic human body plan is present, though non-functional, and as such develop fat cells, hair, teeth, and in rare cases limbs, malformed head, and other structures. The authors of the paper, however, offer the hypothesis that human parthenogenesis producing a viable offspring in nature does occur in extremely rare circumstances, due to a mutation resulting in the deletion of two maternal genes that would otherwise prevent it, but is not noticed because the offspring is otherwise healthy and normal. Spontaneous human parthenogenesis, then, resulting in a viable, normal human offspring can be considered astronomically improbable. I would not take those odds to Vegas, but it is not technically impossible. What is more improbable, even than this, is the human parthenogenesis of a male offspring. Biological sex is generally determined by one's chromosomes, either XX for female or XY for male. The gene which is responsible for determining whether or not a fetus develops testes is called SRY, and is normally contained within the Y chromosome. SRY determines sex by switching off the gene RSPO1, which in turn switches on the gene SOX9, producing a male offspring. In female offspring without the SRY gene, SOX9 has been switched off by the gene RSPO1. This being said, what has been found is that it is possible for RSPO1 to fail during the developmental process, leaving the SOX9 gene turned on, thus producing testes in the fetus as opposed to ovaries, according to an article by Keri Smith. In this article, the author references 4 brothers from the family, all of whom had the XX combination of chromosomes, and none of whom carried the SRY gene. However, each brother carried a mutation of the RSPO1 gene. For the sake of brevity, I will spare you from any more intense technical details than what I have presented to make my argument, but from the articles and sources I have read, while requiring a precise series of mutations occurring in order, that Jesus Christ could have been conceived both male and by parthenogenesis is, while astronomically improbable, within the realm of what is known to be scientifically possible. In this scenario, Jesus, or Yeshua, would have physically been a male genetic clone of his mother, Mariam, with the XX chromosome, but biologically male due to the failure of the RSPO1 gene at a critical stage in embryonic development. One consequence of this scenario is that, in modern clinical terms, Jesus would also have been technically considered intersex, regardless of the completeness of his male physical anatomy. This argument is not made to devalue the scriptural account of his virginal conception by the Holy Spirit in any way, only to demonstrate that the assertion by his followers that he was conceived by parthenogenesis is by no means as impossible or absurd as some have accused. In fact, the series of genetic mutations required is so specific that I would argue it is more plausible God was involved in the process than not, much like the evolution of life on Earth and human beings specifically. Here I see the hand of God working through obscure but natural processes to produce the result he desired, in this case, a son. There is a question to be had as to why God would go to the trouble of this. One hypothesis would suggest that the genetic hamartia disorder I have described in previous videos is passed down through the male chromosome. Without a male human chromosome, Jesus would have been born without our human neuropsychological disorder, hamartia, thus making him sinless, quote unquote. The circumstances of his birth may have contributed to his death by heart rupture. Jesus died within hours of his initial torture and being nailed to the cross. Under normal circumstances, a crucified victim would die slowly over a period of 2 or 3 days from dehydration and asphyxiation. Because the day after Jesus' crucifixion was a Sabbath, out of agreement with the Jewish leaders, the executioners were ordered to remove the bodies before sundown, the start of the Sabbath. However, the condemned men would still be alive. This was the reason why the Roman soldiers were ordered to break the legs of the crucified victims in order to speed up their deaths, and were surprised to see that Jesus was already dead. Thus, the reason why they chose to stab his heart to confirm death rather than break his legs to induce it. If he was, in fact, a male XX clone of his mother due to parthogenetic conception, this may have led to some physical weakness, which a typically conceived XY male would not experience. A similar syndrome where the SRY gene is located on the male X chromosome instead of the male Y chromosome, resulting in a male XX offspring, can result in decreased libido, physical weakness, decreased stature, and malformed or hermaphroditic genitalia. While an argument can be made for decreased libido in the gospel accounts of Jesus' life through his own statements, consider Matthew 19:11-12, as well as that he never married and, speculating, appeared to actively avoid marriage, he is very clearly identified as male in the gospel accounts by his mother and all those who knew him, thus suggesting no ambiguous or hermaphroditic genitalia. It is also recorded by St. Luke in chapter 2 of his gospel that he was circumcised on the 8th day according to Jewish custom. If there is any ambiguity in his genitalia, the circumcising rabbi would have noticed. Also, his height, as recorded by the image on his burial shroud, indicates he was of an average height for a Judean-born man of that period. That, under extreme stress, he suffered from hematidrosis, and less than 24 hours later died from what looks like stress cardiomyopathy, where a typical man wouldn't, may seem to suggest that he might have suffered from an inherent genetic weakness in his physical system. Many people who are born with chromosomal disorders such as Down syndrome also suffer from heart problems, for example. It could be that, due to his parthenogenetic birth, he too suffered from a weaker heart muscle, which could not endure the combination of extreme stresses he underwent during his torture and crucifixion, and causing him to die much earlier than a typical human being might. I know there are some who may take issue with the idea of a physically weaker Jesus Christ in any way. However, it must be remembered that, though fully divine, he is also fully human, with every possibility that implies. It is never recorded that he was particularly physically strong or even heart healthy, as it were. Consider in John 4, where Jesus was tired out after their journey and stayed behind to rest by the well, whereas his disciples were still strong enough to head into town to buy food, and were concerned for his health when they returned, trying to get him to eat something. It is recorded that he attributed everything he did not to his own strength or ability, but to his Father's. It is also recorded that those observing the demonstrations of power he performed were constantly amazed, in particular that they should be performed by him. In this, I am reminded of St. Paul, who writes in his first letter to the Corinthians, 1:27-28, and here I'm quoting from the World English Bible. But God chose the foolish things of the world that he might put to shame those who are wise. God chose the weak things of the world that he might put to shame the things that are strong. And God chose the lowly things of the world and the things that are despised, and the things that are not, that he might bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should boast before God. It occurs to me that nowhere does Yahweh demonstrate this principle more than in the flesh and blood body of his Son, who himself stated that he could do nothing from himself. It is difficult to empathize with or have compassion for someone with no vulnerabilities that we can see. We might respect them, idolize them, worship them even, but empathy and compassion never cross our minds with regards to them. There is an image which comes to our minds with the name Jesus Christ, which implies total invulnerability and perfection. As a result, it can sometimes be difficult to imagine being able to empathize with him, or for that matter, him being able to empathize with us. Jesus, Yeshua, was like everyone's favorite brother, and he had some health issues related to the circumstances of his birth, and it was most probably a congenital heart condition. He engendered trust through not only his teaching, but also his own physical weakness. He had the appearance and energy of someone who is generally harmless. There were moments that energy from him shifted into something of great power, but that had nothing to do with his physical disposition or condition. His disciples, who all became family to him and to each other, sought to protect him for a reason, even as he sought to shield them. He taught them to love each other as well as him, and they did, everyone seeking to care for one another because of each other's weaknesses, not in spite of them. Jesus, as God with us, was also God made vulnerable, because it is weakness and vulnerability that we as human beings are more easily able to relate to, care for, and empathize with. And this facilitates the first and greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your strength, and all of your mind.